as a then we can keep it as a discussion. And one of our points when we run workshops, no matter what kind of diversity we're talking about, is that it's a topic for everybody, and everybody should be able to talk about it. So I'm trying to cover myself behind that today. But yeah, my name is Jakob, and I'm Director of Diversiunity, and there will be a bit about us at the end, but I think we should get started on this right away. So when we talk about gender analysis here, what I am will mainly be talking about EU proposals. That's because that's where they have written the most about it, at least in a European context, and it's a shared context for a lot of people, and also because I can't read all the Spanish course. My Spanish isn't that good. But what we're going to run through today is we'll start about a bit about what a gender analysis is, the whys.
Yeah, Jakob, sorry to interrupt. The volume went a bit down of your microphone.
Oh, sorry. But did that help?
Try again.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
It fluctuates a little bit.
Oh, sorry. Did this help?
Try again, say something more.
How is it better now that I've changed the plus a bit?
It's still a bit up and down.
I don't know what's went wrong here suddenly.
I think today we have a few technical issues, don't worry.
It's one of those days.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think also computers want to go on holiday, so.
Yeah, well, okay, I'll just try and make sure to speak up, and then if it doesn't work, we'll just find some other solution to it.
I think, yeah, like this is fine. Then we'll let you know if for some reason it goes down again.
Yeah. All
okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Cheers. So, yeah, we'll start with the what, the whys, why it's important, why it's so difficult, and then, of course, dive into the hows of research proposal, and then a bit at the end, and we could be flexible about that now that we're running a bit late. Some of the context of how this is developing, because this is an area where things are moving quite quickly. So, what is a gender analysis? First of all, don't panic. Instead, diversity and research can be feel a bit foreign, although it is changing. It's one of the areas where I think it's probably been a bit sometimes it's been a bit late to these changes. Also because it's probably one of the areas where you have a lot of basic blue sky research, basic research, theoretical research, where it can feel a bit foreign. So that is probably completely normal. And for that, it might also feel like it's not necessarily particularly relevant. And it might not be, as I said, if it's really theoretical, finding the gender aspect or looking at your research through a gendered lens will be a challenge. I will give you that. There's no question about it. But the thing is, funders expect you to do this. So if you want European money, you have to figure out a way to deal with this. So, but let's look into a bit about how you can approach this. First of all, you all have a gender equality plan if you are applying for European research funding through Horizon Europe. We all had to develop that. Some were more prepared than others. I think it was the first time that universities really realized that the European Commission is serious about this, and some were definitely caught with their pants down, no question about that. But you all have one, and the focus, as it is required, is by the EU is about the institution and not your the research teams, not the research itself, and that is, of course, a challenge. But the reason we're still mentioning it, and I think you should look into it when you dive into this, and particularly if you're struggling a bit with it, is that it will have some sort of recognition that cultural and demographic and social diversity, and particularly gender diversity, as this is the whole in the name, improves the quality of research and contribute to excellence. And I think the quality and excellence part of it is what's particularly take notice of here. And then, of course, we know that diverse work groups are more innovative, generate more effective and viable ideas, and develop new approaches and carry out more critical analysis. And that's one of the reasons is that simply the fact that we know that there's someone in the same group as us who are different makes us think it through more. We tend to think, I have to explain it better. And through that, we will generate new ideas, and we will develop the ideas simply by the fact of having to explain it in another way. We also know that more ethnic diverse groups have published in better journals, have more citations. There are a lot of things that comes from this, and that will be built into a gender equality plan. And you can try and build on that at least to some extent. So what is a gender analysis? The definition that we're working with is that a gender analysis research is a process of identifying and examining the ways in which gender affects the design, implementation, and interpretation of research studies. It aims to understand how gender influences the research process, from the selection of research topics and participants to data collection, interpretation, and ultimately to the dissemination and use of research findings. And we'll take this in more in steps in a while, but just to say this is, when you say gender has no importance in your research topic, if you look at all these steps of it and the different parts of it, I think that we will find somewhere in this where we can say, actually, I think there is something here. To give an example, and I don't have citations on this because there was someone who started looking into it. So they had just had some early findings that about citations, that because men have more citations than women, part because men are a bit more full of themselves, so they tend to citate themselves more often, but even so, they're really good at citating also each other. One of the reasons they found in this study is that when you look at how an article is framed and the research is framed, also just in the abstract, you will often see that women, and this is a broad generalization, I get that, but there is a tendency that women, when they argue about why they have chosen this, they will have more of an idea of societal impact, why they're doing this for the greater good, whereas men will rather frame it more directly into the context of the science itself. And
Jakob,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt again. It went back again, the audio in the last 30 seconds.
Bloody hell. No,
oh. Yeah. Let's see. Okay, try again.
Now that it's just on the computer?
No.
1 second.
Okay. Sorry.
No. I just mute myself and then find some other headphones. Just a second.
Sure. Take your time.
How is the sound now?
Much better, I think. Yes.
Can you hear anything?
Yeah, we hear you well. Can you hear us?
Good.
Yes. Yeah, it's good.
No, I can't hear anything. But
But I can do like this if I need to say something. Can you hear me?
anyway, does this no?
We hear well, but I guess
Okay. And then why can't I hear anything? What is happening here?
I think I'm bringing a bad karma. Last week I was giving a talk and I was getting an echo after 30 seconds of my words, of my voice, which was, so it's a period in which I have one technical problem after another. So what we could do, Jakob, is that given that but you cannot hear me. I was gonna say, you can continue like this. Let me send him a message.
So, how does this work?
Speak a bit more.
Yes, how does this work?
I think it was slightly better before, but you couldn't hear us, right?
No, I couldn't. But if I just said, because this helped a lot, didn't it?
Okay, this is good.
Yes, good. And now I think I've found a way of where I can both, where you can hear me and I can hear you.
Okay, good, great, excellent. Thank you.
Sorry about all this.
No. Yeah, no problem. It happens all the time. Yes.
And I will close this and I will do this. And you can see what's happening here, right?
Yes, yeah.
Good.
I mean, we heard you well. It was just the last few seconds, really, the last 10 seconds. So
yeah, cheers. Okay, so I'll go back to this. So anyway, as I said, I think I tried to say that what but yeah, there's so many steps here. So we were talking about that article where they had where they basically said that there's something about how we frame research. When we publish things, women, and again, as I said, this is a broad generalization, tend to frame it more as the impact they want to have with it, the reason, the motivation behind it, whereas men often gets more to, this is going to sound more to the point, we'll frame it more directly within the research itself and the findings, and that makes it more citable. It's a lot easier to cite. What isn't interesting is that while men has more citations, articles written by women or with female first authors are more downloaded and more read. So there's simply something about, there is some, they were going to look further into it. It's just to say there are things at play here sometimes, both with how we frame things, how we select a topic, the way we frame the data, how do we interpret things sometimes that could actually impact this and is something we should take into account when we before we dismiss gender as an important frame in this. And also as with this example, how we disseminate it. How are we actually framing it when we're telling it to others what we have found here and why it's important. So an important distinction here is that we, of course, there is sex that refers to biological characteristics, and then we have gender refers to socio-cultural attitudes, behaviors, and identities. And note that they call it a a gender equality plan and a gender analysis. And so when we talk about, I talk about gender in this context, I'm referring to gender as this socio-cultural attitude, behavior, and identities. And we'll get a bit more into that. And now some examples of where this is important. We all know the examples from medicine, as you can see with the example here of the pills. From medicine, where we have seen a number of studies where we test medicine for illnesses that are mainly hits women of color, middle-aged women of color, and what is the medicine tested on? White young men who studies medicine at the university where it is tested. It's becoming less and less frequent, but we still see it. And it's not that long ago where we gave a talk where it's a doctor who said, well, but the problem, of course, with testing, because most medicine are never tested on women. We don't know the side effects of most medicines on women until it has been used for a couple of years. And he said, well, the problem is that women are only hormonally stable for 3 days per month, and it's just so incredibly difficult to test it that way. And I was saying, well, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a woman, but I do think that women take medicine all days of the month, no matter the hormonal cycle. Perhaps we should have an idea of that before. That's just to say that's how far off we are on these topics still. We have the topic of voice recognition, AI, facial recognition, where we have seen there's still significant problems. Queer data, as I've tried to analyze here, is another thing where we have seen problems. And then my final example here in the top, which I absolutely love, and it has absolutely nothing to do with astronomy, but it's just to say an example where nobody thinks there would be a gendered lens to it. And that was in this example is from Sweden, where they had a law a few years back where that said all public services should be looked at from a gendered lens. And in this municipality, they were saying, talking about they did this and that. And then there was the show snubbing. And the department there said, well, thank God, this is easy. There's no gender dimension to this. And that was when someone said, well, perhaps we should take a look at this. Because when we do shovel snow in towns, it turns out, what do we do? We always look at the big roads. We take the big roads first so people can come to work. Who goes to work on the big roads? Mainly men, and they have the car. What don't we do is to do the bike lanes and the pedestrian sides. And who goes there? The women who are taking, and the children who are taking kids to school, and they take the small roads who are done as the last roads. So what basically happened was that they said, so we're leaving it to the most fragile people in traffic to deal with this themselves, and we are helping the people who actually could go through it in their cars. So they switched it all around and started by doing pedestrian sides, bike lanes, and the small roads that led to schools and daycare institutions, etc., and took the large road at the end. And there was a lot of noise about it because that was horrible and people would get late. Actually, people got to work at exactly the same time. What did happen that they had a lot less accidents in the winter, because now the women with a bag of groceries in one hand and a child on the other didn't fall over because there wasn't any snow anymore. So actually taking this to taking this through a gendered lens turned out to save a lot of money, including for the companies, because now people didn't fall and break their arms and legs during the winter. So it's just to say, some of the places where we really think there's no gendered lens, there is. Some of this, if you look at the guide for reviewers in the Horizon Europe, you can see some other examples here, and I won't go that much into them, but that's just to say that the guide for reviewers also tries to help the reviewers, looking at your proposals to help them see these dimensions and think through whether they have taken it taking enough into consideration. Here you can see another classic example is car safety, where it's still not tested on a female body. The dummy they developed to be like a female body is actually more in common with a 14-year-old girl than a grown-up woman. So that's just to say we're still struggling in some of the more classic areas. So this is been through some of this why it's important, and also a bit why it's difficult. One of the things that makes it difficult is that when we believe that we have more in common with other cultures than we actually have, this is often leads to misunderstandings. This is called project similarity. And I think this is particularly prevalent in academia, where we have this idea of a shared academic culture. And this often, I think this leads to often to misunderstandings, because of course we're all part of national cultures, we have gender, we have sexual orientation, etc., and that forms us. And I think there is a real danger in this, and one of the reasons why we're still struggling with some of these topics. And it's difficult because it's a new requirement, and it requires a new way of thinking. And particularly if you're doing basic research or theoretical research, one of the things you have to do is think it through to implementation and thinking who is going to use it, how are they going to use this, the things I'm using, and should I take that into account in developing it, or should I do something about it to make sure that it isn't misused at a later stage? Am I presenting it in the right ways that makes it interesting for everybody, and not just the other 10 white, middle-aged, straight, able-bodied men like me who will see it? And then acknowledge it takes time to develop skills. See how the requirements from Horizon Europe are still quite vague. They haven't been that specific about it. Also for the guide for reviewers, it counts, but it's not, and they're not doing a lot of training for reviewers either. Why? Because this is a first step. They acknowledge it's a bit difficult for everybody, but it is a first step. So don't beat yourself up on this. Give it a go and see what works, and then find a place to start instead of thinking, oh, I have to get it perfect right away. No, you don't. Just show that you're really trying here and you're giving it a go. And I think that will be acknowledged for most in most contexts. Two important questions to ask yourself, I think that can help a lot with this, is what am I not seeing and who can help me see it? And I use that's not only useful here, but in a lot of contexts of life, but particularly here, because we are a bit, as a new thing, we will tend to see things in the same way. And particularly if you're a senior researcher and have junior researchers in your lab that you have followed through their career, they will tend to think like you. So it is a question about finding those people who can actually challenge you on these topics, and we're willing to challenge you on these topics, and then actually listening to them. The moment you say no to someone saying there is a gendered lens, you're probably wrong. So it's about figuring out where in the process could there be something that you're not seeing, and then finding those people who could actually help you either through this network, perhaps, or within your own institution, of course. One of the things that also makes this difficult and why we don't see these things is that we all have biases and stereotypes. And stereotypes are never neutral, and they form our relationships with others. We react quickly and make judgments because our brains are wired to do that. And sometimes that's a good thing, because if I see 3 men running towards me with knives, and I start running in the other direction, that is a healthy stereotype to have about men with knives. But the moment I start running in the other directions, anytime I see a man coming towards me, then it's become an unhealthy stereotype. So that is why we need to develop this knowledge and acknowledging that we have them, pretending that we don't have them. We are only fooling ourselves and making things worse. I have plenty of stereotypes and biases, even if I'm working with and have for a number of years. And yes, they are so culturally ingrained that actually you can have these online tests of varying quality where you can see what kind of biases you have. And I always have a small bias against gay people, even if I'm a gay man, simply because I grew up in a culture where it wasn't accepted. And that is so ingrained in me that still to this day, when I do these tests and do them properly, I will still have a bit of a bias against myself. So how do we develop these gender analysis? Going back to the definition, we try to break it up in a few steps to make it perhaps a bit more, a bit easier, both if you want to go through it all, but also to perhaps say, I'm going to start here, or this is one thing we actually have in place. We'll do something else and work through it as a process. So sometimes there will be some existing literature. We gave a presentation like a bit like this on gender analysis at Impartida, the Nanotechnology Institute in Madrid earlier this year, and actually found out there were not a lot of work, but some work on this already. Also, again, it's not just about this, but also look at the representation, because representation does matter. And one thing is, particularly, is to make a notice of the level of the gender balance in decision makers. One thing is that women are there, but if they're all PhD students and all work package features, etc., are men, you won't have that in the process. Also, as it says, be aware we're talking about gender and not sex. So do, if possible, take non-binary and trans persons into consideration as well. Then, of course, there is a research focus. And there will probably be some things where you can probably see some sorts of divides within your research field. I don't know enough about astronomy. As I said, in the beginning, I studied comparative religion. I know very little about astronomy, but there will probably be there will be different fields within the field of astronomy, and you'll probably see there will be some clusters where there will be more representation of men, and in other clusters, women. And it's always interesting to look into that, and why is this happening, and is there something that could be done about this? Because it is probably a question of framing. Then there's something about safety concerns, how this is going to be used. That is probably not that relevant here unless you're developing some sort of new methods and some sort of equipment. As I understand it, astronomy is a lot of maths. So I don't know how much the idea of the big telescope is perhaps my boyhood dream of astronomy, but still there are some things that could be taken into account perhaps. And then of course the impact. How is this going to be used? Who is going to use it? Will it impact men and women differently? How are they going to use it? And also, as it says here, how are the publication patterns and the framing of the research, as I talked about earlier? Are we framing it and publishing it in ways that is accessible for everybody, or just usual suspects if we want other people to pick this up? And then, of course, there is the decision making. How will gender influence decision making in the process of the development, the regulation, and the use of astronomy in this case. And my guess would be, as in many other fields, you will have perhaps a bit of a bias on gender here. I'll keep rolling here because I know we're running late for technicalities today here. But if we go here and have a look at, this is the A forms in Horizon Europe, and that's of course the administrative forms, but still there are few things I think it's worth take notice of. And the role of participating organizations in the project, and they mention here a lot of roles from all over society, and in that case you have to consider, are they covered and who is the person covering it, both when you go to civil society, etc., etc. Page 30, it also talks about the gender equality plan, which of course indicates that you have this structural approach to it. But you of course have to consider, is that the case in the rest of the research group, particularly if you are working as in a European context across borders, how is the shared view on this within the consortium? The budget, does your budget acknowledge that different groups have different needs? And are there cost implications of this? Because it might actually differ a bit. And then ethics and security, our suggestion is always to say, we always say, go beyond the do no harm and is it legal? Flip that frame and say, can we do good for these groups? Not just make sure that you don't kill them is a rather low ambition, I think. How can we actually do good for these groups, and how might an international collaboration challenge you on this, particularly when we go beyond Europe? If we go into the B forms, that are of course for most of US researchers the most interesting parts, because it's about the actual research and the project. I think the most important thing is notice that the demand for a gender analysis is in the excellence part. Consider this part of excellence. It's not an add-on, it's not something different. It's a part of research excellence that we not just have to be explicit about now. And that's it. The moment we start thinking about it as an integral part of excellence, I think things get a lot easier. But there are things, it mentions it when it comes to methodology, concepts, model, assumptions behind your research. Is there a gendered lens to that, or how it's presented? Have you thought SSH in it, social sciences and humanities into this? What about the methodology, the data? Is that gendered in some way and in the other? And again, if you're talking about gender from outer space, I guess rarely. But if the moment you are linking it to something that other humans are doing or saying or will use it, there might be some way of looking at it through a gendered lens, and particularly how you're presenting the data. In the impact section, there are a few quotes here where you can see a clearly not to gender dimensions, and where we at least think that you should think it through is the narrative explaining how the project's results are expected to make a difference in terms of impact beyond the immediate scope and duration of the project. And there you can see that even if your project itself might be theoretical here and now, you have to think about it when it comes to the impact. And that is perhaps your way of adding to thinking through some gender dimensions that you can take back into the excellence sections if you were struggling there. Be specific, referring to the effects of your project and not research and innovation in general in this field. So really think it through. State the target groups that would benefit. And it's not how they also want the potential negative impact. And they are mentioning the scientific community, the users, the financial sectors, and the public at large. Again, if you're struggling in the excellence section, I think there are perhaps some things here in the impact section that's easier to start with, and who you can take back and help you in the excellence section until you get a better hang of it. And then, of course, in the implementation, list of critical risks and the description of the consortium. And if you haven't mentioned gender in any way there, I think you got it wrong. Okay, I'm aware of time. I'll just run through this quickly, because I think there are...
don't worry.
Cheers. So, and I think why is it important to get started? Not only because you want the money, because you do, and you have to. So that's why you want to do it, isn't it? But still, it is important. And I think it is. There's a reason why they put it in excellence. It's just a question of doing better research. And that's why we have to do it. But also, I think it's important to see this as a first step. This is only the beginning. And there are a few things that we're not just saying it out of the blue, and because we want to panic and hire us to do more work for you. We would like that too, of course, but still. But it's important to, when we say diversity too often in research, we are basically talking about gender. But diversity is so much more than that. It is gender, it's ethnicity, it's race, it's social class, sexual orientation, age, religion, physical ability, neurodiversity, cultural background. All these sort of things impact who we are and how we think about things, how we react. And the European Commission is increasingly aware of this. If you look to the program guide, and not just the topics, but the program guide for the whole of Horizon Europe, they do refer to intersectionality and how intersectionality describes overlapping or intersecting categories such as gender, blah, 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 blah. They're compared to determine the identities and experiences of individuals. Researchers and innovators should not consider gender in isolation. Gender identity, norms, and relations both shape and are shaped by other social attributes. So they have not been as explicit if you go into the topic text or the into the forms where they're describing it. But I think we should take this as a hint that this is where it's moving. And of course, there's a difference. Of course, there's being a white middle-class woman in Denmark is something utterly different from being a poor black woman in rural parts of Kenya. Talking about 4.5 billion people as one is at best naive. Of course, we have to take these things into consideration. And it's significantly different for me to be a gay man in Denmark than it would be if I was a gay man in Saudi Arabia, where I have to remain closeted or get killed. So in that sense, it's just to say things differ on where we are in the world, and we have to take these things into consideration. And you get a better start practicing, because soon it will be a requirement. We think they released a report last year, I think it was now, where they basically talked about how we could make inclusive gender equality plans. And I think before the end of Horizon Europe, I think they will change the requirements for the gender equality plans to be inclusive gender equality plans and have stronger requirements on other dimensions than gender. And with that, I think we'll follow that the gender analysis in the proposals themselves will be diversity analysis, but I don't think that will be until framework 10. But that's just to say there will be more of this, and so start start practicing with this, as long as it doesn't have that big consequences, because everybody's understanding, because soon the requirements will be firmer and they will be more nuanced. Another thing I think is important to look at is the agreement on reforming research assessment, now under QARA. And in one of the principles, it says that ensure gender equality, equal opportunities, inclusiveness, consider gender balance, the gender dimension, and take into account diversity in the broader sense in research teams at all levels and in the context of research and innovation. So as this unfolds and become more tangible, and we see how are we actually going to do this as the collaboration in QARA continues. This is one of the ways you're going to be assessed. This is how we're going to assess research in the future. It's not just on bibliometrics, but this is how it's developing. So we should get good at it. So your next steps, if we just stop here, is to say, if you have considered this, if yes, what have you discovered? And help each other share by sharing that. And if no, after this, what possible implications spring to mind? And then, of course, asking yourself, what am I not seeing? Because this is probably something there. And as I said, this is only, ignoring this is only getting harder. Now is the time to think about, I wish I could present some like magic pill or that one trick that could do it easily, and this is how you do it. But that's the whole point of it. The whole point of it is that we thought we could do it in one way for everybody, and that was when we could had the one trick, and then we figured out it's a bit more complicated than that, and that is why we can help you see a frame, and we can help you ask questions, but it will always differ in the specific context, in the specific context of one proposal to the other. So, are there any questions?
Thanks a lot, Jakob. First of all, well, a round of applause, virtual applause. Thank you. While people think about questions, I have a few thoughts myself. But, one of the first slides, and you repeated it later on, was about the fact that diversity brings, it's positive, right, in research, and in not only research, right, in many aspects of our lives. Mm-hmm. And that brought me the memory of during a committee meeting during my PhD, one of the senior members of my thesis committee said, since women are in science, men get more distracted. And so in that, then like diversity in that sense, gender diversity was considered like a negative thing, right? Yeah. Because it was distracting men from focusing on their science. Yeah. Well, this was more than 10 years ago, but I was wondering, I would imagine and I hope these things are changing quickly, but I don't know, do you have a feeling of how now, like really that is accepted, or are just nice words that people say? Like, is that really now, based on all the talks you give of the people you meet in maybe different fields, is that really now, internalized that diversity is really good? Or there are still groups that consider it negative?
I think a bit of both, and that's a really politician answer, isn't it? But I think I recently learned about the wonderful expression in British expression called "chat shit get banged," and because this is a field where there's a lot of chat shit. There's a lot of nice intentions and people saying all the right things without meaning it. And it rarely has any consequences for them. People get away with murder in this. And I think that is why we saw in the previous, in Horizon 2020, you could basically write a generic paragraph about gender balance. Oh, we don't have the right gender balance here, but we will work on it. And you can copy paste that into every application you wrote. So funders have seen it, and I think that's why they are pushing us. I think with institutions, I think there is a lot of people saying the right things without actually meaning it. I think universities are conservative and slow moving, and perhaps they have to because the nature of research. So they're being pushed by the funders, but because the funders want to see societal impact, and they have found out that society is actually diverse. And so we have to do things, and that would be good. And second thing is Gen Z is now going to be researchers soon, and boy, are they not going to take this easily. They have some very different ideals on this, and they're not staying quiet. If you don't know if you saw the exchange on the Nobel laureate seminar, was it last week or so, where I mean, there's a panel of 4 elderly white men who of course have a Nobel Prize being moderated by another old white straight man. And one of these panel members talks about how difficult it is to be a man in science now, looking at them again, all having a Nobel Prize. I don't think they're suffering that much. And luckily there's a junior researcher, and they are there to learn from these elder people. And that junior researcher challenged him on that explicitly. And they actually had to do an extra session later on to talk this through. And now some of the junior researchers are actually saying this man should not be teaching young researchers anymore because he has it wrong. So I think younger researchers is going to push this significantly. But to forgive people also, I think there are a lot of people with good intentions, but this is become some of these things, particularly when it comes to sexual orientation and race, is so politicized that a lot of people are a bit afraid of doing something, and people want to do things, but they don't know how to do it. They don't know where to start. So sometimes I think it's more of a lack of knowing how to deal with it more than a lack of good intentions.
Thanks. I also, well, I have another question also. Sure. Myself. I mean, I'm now focusing more on astronomy. So, you know, we in Spain, we have these national funding grants, which are, you know, not at the level of the ERCs, but they're similar. You ask for research funds, right, from national research funds. And since I think a couple of years, there is when you apply, there is a bullet thing where you have to write a section where you have to specify if your research has some gender perspectives, right? And somehow, you know, I myself didn't know what to answer there, and I was asking some colleagues, and we were saying, okay, no, and the answer that was given, like that was somehow spreading around for all people applying, was, no, you say that our research doesn't have any gender perspective. Yeah. Astronomy doesn't have any gender perspective. And now, and that's still somehow the feeling. And my guess is that actually we are blind, we are not seeing things right. And as you said, we maybe should do the step of trying to understand what is beyond there. I mean, certainly there is a gender diversity perspective in the people making research group, being part of research group, or different fields in astronomy are more female dominated, or there are more male dominated, or minority, or different kinds of diversity. But then I wonder, like, on the research itself, it's very hard. Like, it's effectively, my question is, how can you try to find something where you really don't even know where to start? So, I mean, the composition of groups, it's that's easy somehow to investigate, right? Or how, you know, how funds are managed, or how the research hours are managed, the research style is managed, impact people of different kind. That's easier to somehow assess. But how the pure science itself that you are doing, what is the diversity there, the impact on diversity? That's very hard. So do you have suggestions on this?
Yeah, again, I think one thing is to, exactly as you said, some fields are more female dominated or male dominated. I think I will start exploring a bit, why is that? Why is this field within astronomy dominated by men and this by women? And looking into, is it something about the science itself in this field? And if so, why? Why does this seem to speak to men more than women? And is that because why we are framing it? And what are we losing by not having different perspectives on this? Because if everybody has the exact same perspective, you're losing out. You're also losing out on how to explain it to other people. So in that sense, I think there's actually, and who is it then shared with? How will this impact the broader astronomy field if it is dominated by one gender and explained in one way? The second, because that, I mean, I know it's not the science of itself, but we're getting there. I think it's a bit of a finding those steps that can take us a bit closer to it. And once you get closer to it, I think it will help. The second place I would start is, say, looking at the impact. Who's going to use it? As I said earlier, think beyond the project itself. Who is going to use it afterwards? Is the use of this data or whatever equipment, methodology, is there a way to think gender into how that is used? And if so, how will we deal with it already now? How should that impact how we work with it? Again, you can't change the way you have to code something to find the right data or whatever it is you might be doing with it, but you can think about the presentation of it, the use of it, and how you should, because if you look at, say, if you go back to the safety of cars, it's not that we didn't know that there would be women in the car and they would be wearing seatbelts. We knew that when we developed seatbelts. We just didn't care. All the men who were in the room, and it's not like we didn't know that voice recognition or face ID or facial recognition AI would be used by other than white men in their 30s, but they were the ones who developed it and they never thought through it. And now a black transgender woman can't use facial recognition. So if somebody had been in the room and had asked those questions, they could probably have changed it at an earlier stage. Now, I know that's different because it would be used directly on human beings, but that's just to say, if you think it through a couple of steps further, I think you can probably find some, and again, don't solve it all the first time around. Give it a go, try and figure something and use it as a first step to get deeper into the matter. But because as I said from the beginning, I understand why you will find it difficult in astronomy. Another way is perhaps to look, if you look into Horizon Europe, if there are topics that you consider relevant particularly in Pillar 2, that are related to astronomy, see if they ask for it there, because the Commission has made it very clear you will have to write a general analysis unless they say you don't have to. And sometimes they do. Sometimes they actually recognize that in this particular topic or this particular project, you don't have to write a gender analysis. So get a sense through that about whether your particular field is so theoretical that you don't have to think about it. But that being said, I still think you should think about it in a wider context, because the project doesn't end with you.
Thanks, very good points, thank you. By the way, a reminder that if you want to write your question also in Spanish or anonymous, feel free to do it. There is a question, Nuria. Could you please give some examples on how departments and scientific groups can actively improve their gender balance and diversity and not just remain in good intentions?
Mm-hmm. So, first of all, I would say hiring procedures. How do you write? There are today some good also software who can help you write job advertisements to make them more gender neutral. We think that's not the case, but it actually is. It has a significant impact who applies. So I think that would be a good first step. Second would be to how do you frame the or how do who's on the hiring panel? Make sure you have a gender balance there, and if you don't have it within the group, then you should get someone from the outside. Also, and I heard this a couple of times now, that where and this is a particular case of a Danish researcher, when she had finished her PhD, and now she's a top researcher, very internationally renowned. When she finished her PhD, when he got her first postdoc, the professor who hired had said, if we have a woman in top 4 and she's not top 1, we hire her. Because if she's in top 4 but not top 1, it's because we are biased, not because she isn't good enough. And she came in number 4 and she got hired. And if it hadn't been that foreseen that about himself, we would never have had one of the top researchers in Denmark. So you can have these things and do these things to get beyond your biases in the recruitment process. Secondly, I think, what are the promoting criteria, and who are you promoting? And because often we will look at who has the best, and I mean, bibliometrics is so contested that, but that's still often what we look at, and publication patterns. And that's of course important, but is that necessarily the best researcher? Also consider who are you asking to do things, because if you have more softer things, go to develop a culture, to be on committees, etc., for more social things or softer things within the department, men will often be asked and say no because they want to focus on their research, and this is left to women, and they take often a huge responsibility in these things that are not rewarded by the institution, and it's absolutely horrible that we do these things still. So either look at who the criteria for promoting people and what is being awarded. If we want these things to change, we have to award the people and the actions who actually change this. Finally, as a first step, in projects, who gets to be work package leaders? Because you can have a lot of women, but if you don't give them the experience, use projects to get leadership experience and management experience if they can't have it in the day-to-day life. I think that is a easy step to take, and you could get some people some good experience. And then finally, look towards your network. I think because if you can't do it yourself, then perhaps someone outside who could help you to be in a project context be in the consortium or some way other, or can you have mentors from other related fields to help women grow in their careers and move into these steps. I think those are some of the things. If we look at it more broadly, this is on gender. I think one of the crucial things in the future, because representation is so important, but everybody can't be represented everywhere, particularly when you talk about intersectionality, is to develop diversity literacy. I think that would become a core competence of both researchers and research managers in the future.
Thanks a lot. We have another question. Thanks, Jakob, for this interesting talk. I have a similar question. In the research field in which I work, the number of male researchers in the field is much higher than the number of female researchers. Every year, there are perhaps a great number of female researchers, but there are still very few. The number of new students and young researchers is also unbalanced towards the male gender. How can we fight this wave and reverse the trend and make women more relevant in the field? Yes, here also we are talking about some specific fields, right? Yeah.
Representation matters and role models matter. bringing it back to myself, because that's, of course, the most interesting and important subject in the world. No, but growing up gay in rural Denmark in the 80s, I remained closeted for a number of reasons. But one of them was I had no role models. I couldn't see myself in anywhere unless I moved to Copenhagen and became an actor or a dancer. And that wasn't me. So I think one of the most important thing is that we actually create role models and promote them for the right reasons. But if we don't have, relating to the question before, if we don't have the right procedures to actually create these role models, that's the first step. Once they are there, promote the hell out of them. Because once you can see that it's an option, then they will come. And then if we go back to how we talked about the gender dimensions in the research and how it is presented, is there something about the way you're talking about this field that speaks more to men than women? And if so, how can you change that? Perhaps it's a way about the way you're framing the research and how it can be used, the relevance of it. There could be something about there probably that is speaking more to men. And then it becomes this continuous vicious cycle. And you probably have to get someone from the outside to say, how could this speak more to women? And that is, of course, being horribly stereotyped, because you can't talk to women as one. But there are some gendered lenses often to it, as we talked about earlier. 3, when you have, what is the culture within the research field and the group? Is it male? How are you talking about women? What are social occasions like? How do you socialize? Is that in a way that speaks to everybody or only to men? How are you considering caring responsibilities? Because we just have to face it, caring responsibilities, both for elders and children, is just bigger with women. Are you taking that into account when planning conferences or workshops, or when you're planning social things? Are you actually taking those things into account and acknowledging that there are differences and trying to support women in developing roles in this field? So in that, because I think at the bottom of it, there's a lot about culture. There's really a lot about culture. Just as you mentioned, Sylvia, even if you said it's 10 years ago, yeah, but 10 years ago is still 2010. Nobody should say something like that in 2010. And they're still saying it today. So in that sense, I think, and as long as we keep this idea about women being a distraction, women not being smart enough, women fitting better into one field than the other, as long as we keep that up, nothing is going to change. And that relies heavily on the culture within a department, an institute, a research group, and the responsibility of that lies with the research leader, the head of department, and that is often a man. And that is why it's important that men learn that talking about gender isn't a women's issue.
Thanks a lot, Jakob. Let me see. There is another question. Again, Nuria, thanks a lot, Nuria, for your questions. Maternity is something that holds back women a lot, because still the metric to measure scientific quality are based on the white man culture, amount of publication, and so on. How do we get away from that?
I think particularly in a leadership perspective, I don't know what. I don't know when we decided that having a child would be a bad thing, that having that experience, how that would motivate you in a different way, how that would change your perspective as a person, how that became a bad thing. It baffles me. It's just incredibly stupid. But that's how I think. So I think, first of all, there is we have to change the idea of how we look at having responsibility and how you grow as a person from that and change issue. Secondly, I know there have been some experiments, for example, with building more in groups, So the moment you go on maternity, someone else can take over. I also know that sometimes some universities, when you get back from maternity, you get a postdoc or research assistant for 6 months to help you catch up to date. I think that is would in many cases be a brilliant support for a lot of people. If you don't have that, I think that would be a way to suggest. I also know that some universities, I don't know how far along they are with it, are basically trying to have, and that would cause a bit of a different problem, because then we're back into the precariat and short-term careers and careers perspectives of junior researchers, but where they would basically perhaps have a batch of junior researchers who are not connected specifically to one project or have a specific funding for something, but are basically there to support more broadly. And that could perhaps, having something like that and use that for covering for maternity leave, particularly, I think would be an interesting experiment to see if you could do that. And that could perhaps also give these researchers more stable, permanent positions, because there will always be use for them somewhere in the system. And that could make sure that during a maternity, a project doesn't lie still, or something is still developed, or something could be worked on while the woman is not there. And then, of course, when you are back from maternity leave, that you actually have support, like, are we supporting childcare if you have to attend to a conference in some way or the other? We often leave that back to the mothers, and then they can't go. Or if you're hosting a conference, are you actually saying, well, you can bring your child and we will actually make sure that we take care of our children during the conference? I think we will see more of that in the future. And of course, as I talked about earlier, just before, social gatherings in a department, when do we do that? Or because if we because we know that a lot of the research and all the good ideas, when does it happen? It happens after the dinner at the pub when we're having an extra drink, and then you write something down on a paper napkin. If you have to go home and put your kids to bed, you're not there. We have to create systems where the social gatherings is for everybody at every time, because then you're not just left behind because you were on maternity leave. Then you continue to be left out because you have to go home to their kids. So that we have to. I think the most important things are some structural changes. First of all, valuing that you have a child and see that as a positive, that teaches you something different and gives you a different perspective that is valuable to every research group.
Thanks a lot, Jakob. Yeah, I remember a friend, colleague, that she was feeling really left out because in her group, all the discussion on science would actually happen at beers after work. And she had 3 kids at home and she could just never go there. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
and that is this is what this is basically all about. I mean, of course, when you're writing the gender analysis on the astronomy research itself, perhaps not, but basically what this is all about is about creating this culture of belonging.
Yeah.
Having this idea that we all belong everywhere in research, and we do create research for everybody, no matter who they are in society.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, that's the ultimate goal, right? Yeah.
Yes. Well,
yeah.
I think I'll have business for quite a few years more before we get there.
Oh, indeed, indeed. All right. Well, if there are no more questions, well, in any case, here you can see also Jakob contacts. So I guess you will not mind if some of us sometimes will come up with something and drop you an email. Or... And
if you just find a question tomorrow or in a week's time, you remember something that you would answer, feel free to contact me on email, and We're mostly active on Twitter and LinkedIn, and you can see the podcast there. I think there's a link. I'll send you the PDFs. I'll make sure there's a link there, but otherwise it can be found both at Spotify and Apple Podcast and wherever you listen to podcasts.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. So thanks again, Jakob, to you. Thanks
Welcome.
a lot for joining us today. Sorry, we had some technical difficulties also at the beginning.
Wow.
And thanks everyone for attending today and for questions. And see you all in September for the next webinar of this series. And Jakob, hope to see you soon again in some occasion. Yeah, I'm sure we'll cross each other.
We're going to Barcelona in September.
Okay,
so,
nice.
Yes, and we're going to get to Madrid again. So Spain. We're in Spain once in a while.
Okay, excellent. Okay,
yes.
Great. Thanks a lot. Okay, yes. Bye everyone. Bye.
Bye.